Hey, APUSH students, let's cover everything you need for Period 8. Before we start, print out the free speed review sheet to help you follow along with this video. It's free and you can find the link in the description below. Right now, look at Period 8. Circle any people, event, vocabs, think that you might not quite remember that you know you need to focus on as we review. Once you're confident that you've mastered a topic, you can check it off and move on to the next. Alright, here we go. Following World War II, America experienced significant economic growth. The GI Bill gave veterans the opportunity to receive a college education and buy a home. This contributed to the baby boom and the rise of the Sun Belt region. And Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Act connected the country, improved trade and travel, and made road trips a popular pastime. Neighborhoods like Levittown represented the American dream for many families by offering affordable, mass-produced homes in the suburbs. Also, the television brought families together around the small screen, shaping popular culture by influencing fashion, music, and even politics. This all contributed to a growing culture of conformity for American families. However, teens rebelled against this by listening to rock and roll music, while the Beats wrote novels like The Affluent Society to criticize these social norms. Following World War II, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a Cold War. America joined both the United Nations and NATO, officially abandoning its policy of isolationism. In an effort to combat communism, America adopted a policy of containment, which was recommended by George Kennan in his long telegram. Early examples of containment include the Truman Doctrine, which successfully repelled communism in Greece and Turkey, and the Marshall Plan, which provided financial aid to help rebuild war-torn Western Europe. Containment was also seen in proxy wars like the Korean War, where the United States and the Soviet Union indirectly engaged in warfare. Even though it ended in an armistice and Korea remained divided, it was seen as an early success of containment. During his 2 terms, President Eisenhower built upon Truman's Cold War policies. His Eisenhower Doctrine pledged military aid to Middle Eastern countries that were threatened by communism. He was also more willing to threaten the use of military force, including nuclear weapons, to achieve foreign policy objectives. This was known as brinkmanship. But upon leaving office, he warned of the dangers of the growing military-industrial complex that occurred during his presidency. At the end of the Korean War, Cuba fell to communism, making it a hotspot for the Cold War due to its close proximity to America. The Kennedy administration oversaw the failed Bay of Pigs incident and brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War played a large role in American culture during this time period, too. Fears over communism led to the Second Red Scare. Americans built nuclear fallout shelters and children practiced duck and cover drills. And Senator Joseph McCarthy led a series of witch hunts against accused communists in the government and the army. America also heavily invested in defense industries and space research to keep up with the Soviets in the arms and space races. There was also a renewed push for civil rights in the 1950s as African Americans fought for equality and an end to racial segregation. The landmark Supreme Court case, Brown v. the Board of Education, declared segregation in schools unconstitutional, a huge victory for the movement. Integration, however, was met with fierce resistance. For example, the Little Rock Nine faced hostility, and the National Guard was sent in when they tried to integrate Little Rock Central High School. Peaceful resistance and civil disobedience were the main methods for fighting for change. Rosa Parks led the way when she refused to give up her seat on the bus, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Also, Martin Luther King Jr. was a key figure in the civil rights movement, advocating for nonviolent protest in his letter from a Birmingham jail and by delivering his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The Greensboro sit-ins were another form of peaceful protest, where African-American students sat at a whites-only lunch counter demanding equal treatment. But not everybody agreed with the strategies of the movement. Malcolm X and groups like the Black Panthers advocated for Black empowerment and self-defense. The movement achieved several legislative victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a huge milestone that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And following the horrors that were shown on television like Bloody Sunday, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed and the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. As the fight for civil rights carried on at home, a fight for democracy was happening in Vietnam. President Eisenhower warned of a domino theory in Asia, arguing that if Vietnam were to fall to communism, others might as well. Tensions in Vietnam continued to escalate under President Kennedy, but he tried to limit American involvement. But America officially got involved in the war following an alleged attack on the U.S. Navy by the North Vietnamese. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson the green light to use military force in Vietnam. Within a few years, America had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. A draft lottery was also instituted, fueling protest and resistance from the counterculture movement, especially on college campuses. The Vietnam War was America's first televised war, showing live coverage of events like the 1968 Tet Offensive. The surprise attack on the American and South Vietnamese forces was a turning point in public opinion because it shook confidence in the war effort. News of the brutal My Lai massacre also fueled anti-war sentiments. And the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 confirmed Americans' concerns, proving they had been lied to about the state of the war, especially by the Johnson administration. Nixon was elected in 1968 in part because he supported a policy called Vietnamization. When he became president, he gradually began withdrawing American troops. In 1973, Nixon declared the U.S. had achieved peace with honor with the signing of the Paris Accords, which ended the war in Vietnam. It's also important to know President Johnson's domestic agenda because it's been all over the exam. LBJ expressed in his inaugural address that he was going to wage a war on poverty, and he was able to get significant legislation passed to help some of America's most vulnerable groups. This included healthcare reforms such as Medicare and Medicaid. He also signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and created the Department of Housing and Urban Development. His vast reforms became known as the Great Society. This was the most expansive social welfare legislation passed since FDR's New Deal. Some, especially conservatives, opposed these new policies, arguing that they increased government spending and bordered on socialism. Nixon's foreign policy was based on détente. He and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger hoped to de-escalate Cold War tension. He did this through the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which was the first time in the Cold War where both sides agreed to limit their nuclear arsenals. And by visiting China, he reopened lines of communication and trade. The Arab-Israeli War also took place during Nixon's presidency. As a result of supporting Israel, OPEC nations placed an embargo on the United States. The embargo caused oil prices to skyrocket, long lines at gas stations, and an economic recession. But Nixon's second term was overshadowed by the Watergate scandal. The scandal involved the illegal break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters by members of Nixon's administration. After being caught trying to cover up the scandal, Nixon chose to resign before being impeached. He remains the only president to resign from office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon's vice president, Gerald Ford, took office following his resignation. One of his first actions as president was to pardon Nixon, which angered some Americans who wanted the president brought to justice. Also during his term, Vietnam saw the fall of Saigon, which was a huge victory for communism. And Ford battled poor economic conditions, including continued inflation. Despite his Whip Inflation Now campaign, the economy did not recover, and Ford lost his bid for re-election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter. Carter also only served one term as president. His term was plagued by rising inflation, high unemployment, and continued oil shortages. Carter, however, was praised for his role in the Camp David Accords, a political agreement between Egypt and Israel, but he was criticized for his handling of the Iranian hostage crisis. After 52 Americans were taken hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, President Carter failed to negotiate a release of the captives. This, combined with his malaise speech, contributed to the victory of Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. During the 1960s and 1970s, a modern environmentalist movement also emerged. The movement was inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which shed light on the harmful effects of pesticides on the environment and wildlife. This led to increased awareness about the need to protect the environment and paved the way for important environmental regulations like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. In 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was also created, a huge victory for the movement. And Earth Day was created in 1970 as well to raise awareness for environmental issues and promote sustainability. Students were utilized to support this cause, just like they were in the movement against the Vietnam War. The successes of the African American civil rights movement inspired other groups to challenge societal norms and demand equality. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan sparked a wave of feminism. Groups like the National Organization of Women advocated for gender equality and pushed for the Equal Rights Amendment, but the ERA never passed, in part because of a backlash from conservatives. LGBTQ+ rights also gained momentum, with activists demanding an end to discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The 1969 Stonewall riots were seen as a pivotal moment in the fight for rights for the LGBTQ+ community. There was also a movement for Latino rights. Cesar Chavez, the founder of the National Farm Workers Association, advocated for farm workers' rights and fair treatment for Latinos in the United States. This coincided with the Chicano movement, which advocated for political and social rights for Mexican Americans. And the American Indian movement fought for the rights of indigenous people, pushing for the recognition of their sovereignty and advocating for cultural preservation. They were most well known for their year-long occupation of Alcatraz Island. So what does this look like on exam day? For causation, you can see questions about the effects of the Cold War. For comparison, you want to be able to compare the tactics of various civil rights leaders from Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X. Or you could be asked to compare the similarities and differences between the Cold War policies of each of the presidents. And for change and continuity, you'll most likely ask how American foreign policy changed after World War II. Remember, after World War II, America finally abandoned its long-held tradition of isolationism. Check out the APUSH Ultimate Review Packet for more help. We've got timelines, study guides, and essay practice. Follow the link in the description below for a free preview. And if you think this video is helpful, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.